And again, casting my mind back to Barclays days when I travel a lot in Africa and the Middle East, foundations were really coming on the radar screen because Jersey had created foundations, and I quickly realised that certainly in the Middle East it was a more compelling thing to talk about than trusts, because a lot of people struggled with the idea of, would you like to hand over your assets to this gentleman in a suit? Because in those days bankers wore suits, and it wasn't an enormously compelling proposition on the face of it. But with foundations, because they were more like companies, they were much more readily understood by, guess what, people who run companies. So I used to say to these people, I have to say they tended to be gentlemen, but I said, you must know how to run a company. And they usually brightened up and said, yes, I'm running 170. So I said, well, the foundation's more like a company, but we need a chairman of this foundation, and who better than yourself? Because you've proved to be a very adept chairman. So there's normally a meeting of minds. And of course, that was one major selling point for the foundation, is it is much more proximate to the levers of control, because the council members can consist of the wealth owner, the business owner, his family members, and other advisors. I have to say the stumbling block with the Jersey Foundation at the time was Jersey insist on having a qualified person on the board. So if you were, for example, using the old Barclays Trust Company Zedra, you would have to have someone from Zedra on the board of a Jersey Foundation, and that did make people and I mean, fascinatingly, if that's quite the right word, when Guernsey came up with their foundation rules, they didn't have to have a qualified person on the board.
I just wanted to pick up on your point about, who do you trust, and if you don't trust anyone, don't create a trust structure. I think it's really important because a lot of people see trusts as a legal entity. They're not legal entities, they're relationships. And it's a relationship built on trust. You're effectively splitting up the legal ownership of an asset, and you're handing it to someone who you trust and saying, I trust you to manage this asset in a way that is in the best interest of the beneficiaries. And in my own personal experience, I do feel that sometimes the concept of trust is hard for Nigerians. Many people don't trust members of their own family, or they've been disappointed by business associates. And I remember as a child, we used to drive to the village, and it always surprised me that people used to write on the side of their house, do not trust my brother, this house is not for sale. So, we've got a long way to go to get to a level of complete trust with this type of structure, but I just wanted to say at the outset, it is a relationship, and so you have to be comfortable with that relationship before you hand over your assets and your significant wealth. One of the common issues that arises in trusts, and I've seen this in my experience working with Jonathan as well, is a lot of information, and not just trusts actually, foundations, a lot of information sits within the head of the family. It sits within his right-hand man. It's not written down, they don't need to write it down. As the structures evolve over time, people move on, people have health concerns, people pass. And from an HMRC perspective, inquiries can happen where they're asking questions about scenarios and commercial decisions that are 6 years old, that are 20 years old. And so HMRC are a creature of documentation. You can tell them something, but they'll believe it if you show them something. And the best type of document is a contemporaneous document, or as close to contemporaneous as possible. Because the view they take is, well, it's all well and good you telling me now this was a commercial decision, but you don't have any documents from the relevant period that prove that that was a commercial decision. So we work with advisors, we work with trust companies, we work with fiduciary service providers to stress test those structures and say, well, what if someone comes knocking on the door? What types of documents, what types of assumptions are we relying upon that actually, if something happened, we don't have the documents for? And sometimes it's as simple as a board meeting minute, saying, well, we all sat down, we decided this was a very good commercial decision, but we want to take legal and tax advice on it. All of a sudden, you have a document which makes very clear, yes, of course, we're going to be sensible and pragmatic and take legal and tax advice, but it wasn't only tax that drove our decision-making. There were other factors within the business, within the family, which drove that decision making. So sometimes stress testing isn't always kind of waiting for an attack and kind of firefighting at the time. I think there are key events that happen within the life cycle of a business and with a family, which could prompt a very simple and a slightly more cost-efficient way of bolstering the structures from an attack, whether it be from a disgruntled family member or a business issue or a tax authority. So I think when we think about, stress testing and the solutions to mitigate, if we're doing it little and often and being pragmatic and telling our advisors what's going on, we're only as good as what you tell us. So if your right-hand man leaves and you don't tell us, we can't advise you on, well, what do we need to put in place to ensure that information is retained within the business?
Like in terms of jurisdiction, it will be really like the Singapore, Mauritius, Isle of Man, Jersey, Guernsey, Cayman, but it all falls like what is the requirements of the client, like in terms of proximity, in terms of, your presence of your wealth managers and all your stakeholders. So this is where the trusted advisor also comes in, not only to pinpoint on one jurisdiction, but really go through that stress test to say, like, what are your future objectives of the foundation or the trust, and then match the jurisdiction with the requirement to ensure that you have the right vehicle for the years to come.
So a trust effectively splits out the ownership of an asset. So every asset has both a legal owner, so the person whose name legally owns the asset, and the beneficial owner, which is the person who receives the benefit from an asset. So you may have a property where on the deeds, somebody's name is on the deeds, but actually the rental income is being received by somebody else. A lot of the time they're held by the same person, but it is possible to split the legal and the beneficial ownership. Where you have a trust structure, you are consciously deciding to split the legal and the beneficial ownership of an asset. And you are entrusting the trustees to manage that asset in a way that the asset is managed in the best interests of the beneficiaries. So the trustee is duty-bound when making decisions to ask themselves, is this decision in the best interest of the beneficiaries? And so if it's not, then they cannot take that decision. But ultimately, it's a combination of wanting to look at the ongoing growth of assets. It can also be an asset protection issue. So some people don't want things in their personal name. They would rather have a third party holding assets and managing them for them. Conversely, a foundation is a legal construct. It is an entity. The foundation is the entity, like a company. And effectively what you do is you transfer the assets and the decision-making to the foundation. So you're not necessarily splitting up the legal and the beneficial ownership. You're saying, I would like my assets held by a foundation, and there are various governance and constitutional options within a foundation that allow the patriarch to retain control over how the assets are run and be part of that decision-making in a way that when you give your assets over by way of trust, you lose that right. So it's not about what does the settlor want, the person who settled the trust. It's about what do the trustees think is in the best interest of the beneficiaries. And so there may be divergence between what the trustees decide and what the settlor ultimately wanted. And so it's that element of control which causes people to think about what is the right structure for them. And that's why when I think someone was asking about kind of the governance of a trust relationship, there's only so much governance that a settlor can put in place when ultimately they've given up the rights and responsibilities to someone else. So you have to be comfortable with an element of loss of control with a trust, but it has benefits in terms of ensuring those assets are run in a way that's not just for the benefit of the patriarch or the settlor, but actually future classes, which could be children, grandchildren, spouses, charitable needs. You know, you can choose who you want to benefit from the trust, but you cannot make decisions as to how that benefit actually is borne out outside of the confines of the trust deed, which is, as Bimpe has said, can be, for some people, too restrictive in terms of their control. I hope that's been helpful to whoever asked that question.